The talk I'm going to give today is actually going to be published soon, I think, in New Global Studies. That was a bit of a surprise. I thought I would use the talk to sort of further my thinking through this, but their timeline was accelerated. So I actually finished a full draft, which I'm going to share part of today with all of you. And so I'll just get started. The spread of COVID-19 has shifted the ways in which humans relate to one another. And certainly the notion of who constitutes the public in discussions of public health has shifted to a global scale. Pandemic is, of course, one figure for globalization. In this case, the disease is relevant to those who track ostensibly Chinese circulations, since the epicenter of the viral outbreak is China, with ripple effects reaching across the planet. The fact that President Donald Trump, who I hope will be out of office soon, insists on calling it the China virus, illustrates a recurring conflation of China and worldwide risk. This talk addresses such concerns, if somewhat obliquely, in terms of what it means, what it might mean to label something as Chinese far outside the borders of China. Here I'm expanding my research on Chinese cultural assertion, capital accumulation, and artistic invention presented in my book, The Chinese Atlantic. Specifically, I discuss what I call Oriental sensitivity as a methodology for thinking about Chinese inflected processes of globalization. I introduce the term Oriental sensitivity in the Chinese Atlantic, where I develop it in relation to the shifting demographics of Martinique and the activities of a Tai Chi club on the island. This concept, which I deploy intending to evoke irony in a monograph about what one might initially understand as Eastern circulations in the West, describes a part of my research process. In this instance, the aptitude for studying ostensibly Chinese flows in the Francophone Caribbean, and also the contradictions engendered in the doing of that work. Oriental sensitivity names in part the paradoxes produced when an Asian American professor from the US examines a physical practice generally recognized as Chinese in a geographic region thousands of miles from this martial arts purported site of origin. This article extends Oriental sensitivity beyond the coordinates of my case study and in relation to theories of Orientalism more broadly, in order to elaborate this concept as an analytical tool for global research. And I'm just going to share my screen with you so you can see some of the images. Okay, so this, just so you know, is the Bay of Fort-de-France in Martinique. And if you'd like to contact me after the talk, feel free to use my email here. The UC, the academia edu address is quite old and I haven't updated it in a few years, but my early work is all available to you for free. And someday I'll actually finish updating it so that you can access my new work. This is the book. And then we're on Said here. I borrow hereafter from Said and his numerous commentators that a variant of Orientalism might be modified and mobilized as a hermeneutic for global studies. In my work, I have tended to describe the global through the increasing frequency and speed of communication networks, economic developments from industrialization to financialization, volitional and forced human migrations, and challenges to, but sometimes reinforcements of, formal structures of governance like those of nation states, but also informal regulatory discourses like gender norms. My publications generally tend to query different aspects of the aforementioned list by tracing how the transnational movements of things understood to be Chinese, that is aesthetics, investments, people, products, etc., shape the world in which we live. In this regard, the Chinese Atlantic focuses on the ways in which forces construct Chineseness across disparate sites and how such constructions might facilitate new figurations of the global. My analysis of such dynamics produces the central interventions of the book. Globalization is first and foremost a visualization of totality, whether in narrative or other form. Such a way of seeing is necessarily hyperbolic and theatrical. China serves not only today, but also historically as one vector to approach globalization that complicates the assertion of the Atlantic as the cradle of advanced capitalism. Continuing interrogation of the contingent phenomena we call globalization can be productively focused through the way we imagine and image the sea. Whereas an engagement with Orientalism shapes the background of the Chinese Atlantic, here I foreground that discussion. Overlap and tension exist between theories of globalization and Said's claims about, quote, Orientalism as a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient, end quote, because both discursive registers would promise a worldview. Said explains Orientalism as a discourse in a Foucauldian sense, offering the aforementioned definition of the titular term of his book after moving through Orientalism as a professional field of scholarship and Orientalism as a style of thought based on an ontological and epistemological distinction between the Orient and what he calls most of the time the Occident. His archive, as you know, primarily consists of British and French texts beginning in the 18th century, the period that for him birthed modern Orientalism, which reveals a power matrix that subsumes any stable reality to which the Orient might refer. In a well-known formulation, Said argues that, quote, a distribution of geopolitical awareness into aesthetic, scholarly, economic, sociological, historical, and philological text is how he would define Orientalism. He continues, it is an elaboration not only of a basic geographical distinction, the world is made up of two unequal halves, Orient and Occident, but also as a whole series of interests. It not only creates, but also maintains, end quote. Although Said focuses on textuality, his understanding of a kind of visualization that implies power-laden relations of looking has been often exported to other locations beyond the purview of his study and across various media. In this regard, it is akin to globalization as it describes less what we perceive than how. Such a perceptual shift has to do with attention to scale and networks that reach across vast distances, with multiple actors shaping their character and vice versa. In contrast, Said's book on Orientalism theorizes a monolithic structure, with power moving unidirectionally, radiating from Europe outward. For this reason, Elisa Lowe, as one example, revises Said's theory, arguing that Orientalism is profoundly heterogeneous. Although I agree with Lowe, I also find within Said's text productive assumptions that align Orientalism and globalization. The sheer scale of the geopolitical awareness of which Said writes leads him to describe Orientalist perception in theatrical terms. Drawing from some of the earliest Western dramatic representations of the East, including Aeschylus's The Persians and Euripides' The Bacchae, Said describes an intellectual and potentially a material project of articulating Asia by and for Europe. He writes, quote, the idea of representation is a theatrical one. The Orient is the stage on which the whole East is confined, a theatrical stage affixed to Europe, end quote. Globalization, as I have argued following Samuel Weber, also imagines totality through analogy to certain kinds of theater. In this regard, theories of theatricality are useful because they encourage interrogation of how one perceives the globe when one always inhabits a location inside of it. Attention to positionality and the negotiations of power that facilitate certain worldviews bring Orientalism and globalization productively together. Prior to engaging in my particular vision of Orientalism as a knowledge paradigm for understanding certain kinds of global interchanges, I'm going to first explain the context through which my notion of Oriental sensitivity emerged. I moved from the larger project of the Chinese Atlantic, which aims to explore how artistic productions might elucidate and complicate theories of globalization. In addition to summarizing its contributions, I inflect the argument towards poetics. I then turned to the specific case of Martinique, where I focus on individual bodies engaged in a culturally specific form of calisthenics. I revisit my field notes here to explore the conditions that gave rise to my theorization. I then reframe and extend Oriental sensitivity. Throughout this essay, I detail aspects of the writing and revising process that created the Chinese Atlantic. In other words, I'm interested in methodology. Given that my book as an object is a discursive construction of the global, I tried to attend to the otherwise hidden inputs and contexts that shaped my published ideas, as well as the points where the research process might have yielded other outcomes under different conditions. So this next part is the Chinese Atlantic as an intervention in global studies. The book is a multi-sided analysis of art objects and practices that interrogate oceanic paradigms as representations of and tools for understanding transnational discourses and processes yoked under the rubric of globalization. In my view, globalization is usually invoked as a metaphor for networks or phenomena that occur or seem to occur on a planetary scale, from global warming to the World Wide Web. To reiterate, my text presses on the aesthetic elements used to illustrate these systems. In other words, rather than name particular undersea cables as facilitating communication from several locations to others, most people find it much easier to describe the results of this infrastructure as the cloud, something that hovers over us and that elicits a very specific mental image, far removed from a submarine environment. The cloud is an efficient analogy that draws attention away from the materials and labor that found most global communications. Again, as a metaphor wherein one thing substitutes for something else, globalization is a theatrical discourse. The subtitle of my talk today gestures towards Aristotle's Poetics, one of the earliest extant dramatic theories. Among other topics, the text addresses the author's thoughts about how aesthetic form functions, and it analyzes the mimetic relationship of the arts to life. Today, poetics, of course, more generally denotes literary techniques. Although I don't use poetics as a term in my book, because I acknowledge material, culture, and history as much as aesthetics, I find it useful here to emphasize the importance of thinking about language and the aesthetic forms of expression in addition to content. Scholarship and popular discourse on globalization often fail to acknowledge these qualities. In English, journalists and pundits frequently substitute globalization for complex processes that exceed easily localizable frames of reference. Therefore, in order to frame the global differently, the book returns attention to the reticulation of metaphoricity and theatricality as constructed through the formal devices of mostly visual media. So I'm just thinking of, again, the way that we imagine, when we imagine globalization, there's always some sort of image that's generated in our heads, and here's one for you to think through. My book uses seascapes as its major conceptual metaphor. As my previous examples of both the internet and global warming suggest, our visualizations of oceans serve as barometric understandings, or sometimes misunderstandings, of purportedly all-pervasive phenomena. The transnational networks we refer to as global have been much discussed and critiqued, especially within social science literature. But the arts and humanities facilitate further thinking about the potentialities and imaginative projections produced through transnational encounters that solely empirical research cannot so easily encapsulate. How do we perceive and also imagine the world around us? Seascapes provide a response to such questions as technologies, representations, and importantly, inventions of different ways of seeing. So the book, if you've read it, you know this already, but just for those of you who haven't, it starts with several kind of classic seascapes from Western art history. The seascape, by the way, is a Dutch imperial invention from the Dutch Golden Age. So I start with Wrath of the Medusa, move to Eternal the Slave Ship, and then because of one of the artworks I'm interested that depicts China is heavily invested in Ayvazovsky's The Ninth Wave. I also have that, but did that disappear? No, I'm not sure. Sorry, I thought I had Ayvazovsky in here, but I guess not. In any case, this one is dedicated, sort of riffs on The Ninth Wave as a acknowledging embodied sensory experience as significant, I try in my monographs to track aspects of the sensorium and also to enact sensory effects in the reader by using proximate metaphors in my analyses. This strategy attempts to develop a rhetoric that speaks to each book's object of study. In the case of the Chinese Atlantic, the prose intentionally tries to immerse the reader in a watery discourse in order to develop a lexicon that facilitates seeing through the sea. In other words, the style is a form of performative writing meant to emphasize the ways in which language mediates knowledge. Aesthetic forms both reveal and shape epistemes. The chapter that features Oriental sensitivity especially reminds readers that research is an embodied act, and that corporeal reactions to places help contour what otherwise might appear as an effort to observe objectively, in a manner unmitigated by the researcher's imbrication in the very processes being monitored and critiqued. In this regard, clarity was not the goal of my writing in the Chinese Atlantic. I know that seems strange, but it's true. Rather, I would have preferred readers to be forced to engage the murkiness of my oceanic perspective, where objects and organisms drift into view, where perspective is contingent in locating oneself via an orienting constellation or a particular landmark. For me, that is the experience of seaways, and it is analogous to my experience of globalization, continuously immersed, yet only sometimes able to get my bearings. Of course, one cannot always realize one's desires. In the final drafts of the book, I added several subheadings and other textual devices to work like buoys, to assist readers in tracking the flows of the argument. I mention this evolution of my text because Oriental sensitivity signals the messiness of encounters produced in research of this kind. The Chinese Atlantic tracks different currents of Chineseness in and beyond its titular oceanic region, and it names phenomena that are speculative as well as empirical. Through this opening of maritime discourses, I encourage us to think about how things flow together, about how globalization might be understood differently by complicating conceptual models and observable structures and events designated by a pelagic term. I refine the general approach of the Chinese Atlantic through several case studies. The substantive chapters of the Chinese Atlantic investigate sets of seascapes moored to particular locales that generate what I call logics. These logics build a nautical phraseology to help explain transnational processes that inflect. The logics I elaborate are reeling, incorporating, flowing, eddying, and eddying with aquatic scenes that stretch from China to the Caribbean to England to South Africa. My elaboration of the seascape serves as a rejoinder to Arhun Appadurai's scapes, articulated through what he calls the cultural dimensions of globalization. Whether viscous or constituted in some other physical state, seascapes depend on and evoke material relations as much as, and sometimes more than, conceptual ones. And here are a couple images from this. So this art exhibition is from Trinidad, and it was gesturing towards the shipping containers that were in the Trinidad port at that time. Whether viscous or constituted in some other physical state, seascapes depend on and evoke material relations as much and sometimes more than conceptual ones. Indeed, seascapes facilitate visualizing the abstractions of which Appadurai writes precisely by taking planetary scale systems like tidal movements and placing them within a delimited frame. In this regard, I developed a theory of Oriental sensitivity in relation to seascapes to think about how individual bodies engage the global at the level of the corporeal. Okay, let's shift to Martinique now. In reconsidering my work in the Chinese Atlantic, I have looked back at some of my notes that informed my writing, as well as earlier drafts of the overall text. Initially, I had decided on Martinique as a case study because of its rich intellectual tradition and because I wanted to contrast Chinese migration in two former colonial plantations in the Caribbean that had eventuated in distinct political structures: the independent nation state, which is Trinidad and Tobago, and the French Overseas Department, or Martinique. Long enamored of the artists in the Francophone island who expressed and oftenly engaged in politics like Césaire, Fanon, Posse, and others, I was interested in their expansive demonstration of interconnection that I thought might yield interesting insights into either traces of or ways to limn Chineseness. At the same time, I had intended to do an archival study at the Bibliothèque Chaucher, which is named after Victor Chaucher, who is the famous abolitionist from the region. And I was hoping to find whatever records of coolie traffic remained extant. The third stream of my research involved looking at putatively Chinese circulation through Martinique's Tai Chi clubs. Overall, I intended to do an archival and formal analysis of different expressive cultural products that highlighted how Chinese flows might connect this small island to global discourses and processes. When I first visited Martinique in 2012, I found scant mention of Chinese migrants. My archival search dovetailed with one published volume I had found. The staff at the library had difficulty assisting me in finding further materials that might advance my research. These difficulties brought me to a temporary impasse. I already knew Martinique had been a sugar plantation with the accompanying demographic shifts common to the Caribbean archipelago. The Carib people had first encountered Columbus on their shores in the early 16th century. The European colonial competition eventually resulted in the first wave of French settlers in the early 17th century when they fled St. Kitts and the British. By 1685, the transatlantic slave trade had transformed the region, and Martinique and nearby Guadeloupe became pivotal to French sugar production, to the extent that France gave up all of Canada to keep its Caribbean possessions. As abolition loomed, indentured labor arrived in the French Antilles, including a wave of Chinese migrants in the later 19th century. Unfortunately, this documented history had not yielded much material in terms of extant cultural products. So I remained a bit flummoxed as to what archival materials I would find to focalize a project on Chinese flows. At the same time, I saw several signifiers of Chineseness in multiple locations around the island. When I walked through downtown Fort-de-France, I encountered a number of storefronts, snacks, or fast food counters, and bazaars with Chinese characters on the facades of buildings or in shop windows. On the highway to the nearby city of Lamentin, I saw what appeared to be a factory with the name OUN. And so that's Ho, like H-O, OUN. These sites led me to seek more information about the Chinese migrants who currently inhabit Martinique. So I began by making inquiries into those questions with a bunch of the shopkeepers around. I'm skipping over all the details of those encounters just to get to the conclusion of that. But here's an example of one of the shops that you'll see quite often around Martinique in the capital now. Martinique's economic situation seemed to register most viscerally in witnessed demographic changes in the capital. In relation to Fort-de-France's financial vitality, I heard several times that the minute a Martinican closes shop, generally meaning a non-Chinese person, a Chinese person opens something in its place. Such apparent displacements of local people, or what is considered local, led to characterizations of Chinese shopkeepers as hardworking, sometimes avaricious. Most disconcerting to me was the description of Chinese merchants as le niveau de base, the lowest common denominator, in contrast to refined people who might care and celebrate the longue durée of Chinese traditions. From this perspective, those who knew about, appreciated, and involved themselves in Chinese aesthetics established some relationship to an authentic version of Chineseness. The workers who had arrived overseas from Asia, on the other hand, were frequently figured as rapacious. Indeed, when I happened upon a local Afro-Martinican performer named Bobby, such perspectives were materialized in his burlesque of the Chinese shopkeeper on stage. As I tried to parse my research, I dwelled on what sorts of frameworks people had to make sense of Chinese populations on the island and how such schema might inform their empirical observations. And I realized that I too had arrived with several assumptions. These considerations led me to think through what I called Oriental sensitivity. And so this next part is Oriental sensitivity redux. In my book, I float Oriental sensitivity to mark the conundrums of my research process. The term flags a transition from cultural expertise to cultural unease. On the one hand, despite or perhaps because of my previous study and my own familial background, I came to the study of Martinique, Tai Chi, and Chineseness with certain assumptions that I've detailed in the book. On the other hand, my interlocutors often projected certain understandings onto me once that they knew I could claim kinship with a larger Chinese diaspora. In terms of my interlocutors, one suggested that she had always felt Chinese in spite of not having any Chinese relatives. She apparently enacted such connections through mastery of Tai Chi, a form of ostensibly Chinese physicality to which she had access. Other people with whom I spoke expressed a more oppositional viewpoint when it came to China and Chineseness, as revealed in the occasional disdain expressed for recent Chinese migrants. Both outlets converged in the sense of being sensitive to the presence of Chinese people and culture. These incongruous declarations inspired me to return to Frantz Fanon, an intellectual whose influence informs much of my scholarly oeuvre. Oriental sensitivity references and to some extent recites Fanon, since he observed in Algeria, but I extend his notion beyond that particular situation, that the, quote, violent confrontation between the colonized and the colonial system, end quote, produced what he calls sensitivity. So the English translation usually says sensibility, but in French it's actually sensitivité. So extrapolating from Fanon's mention of sensitivité, I developed Oriental sensitivity to think about cultural flow, corporeal engagement, and contradiction in the setting of Martinique today. How might one adopt Fanon's analysis when the binary of colonizer and colonized proves inadequate to encapsulating the current situation, especially in light of the fact that Martinique's most recent wave of Chinese immigration elicits paradoxical descriptions of them as thieving opportunists or laborers with few options for class advancement, or indeed as heirs to a venerable world civilization of which Tai Chi is one globally circulating product. Sensitivity also describes an interruption and reconsideration of my own research process. Because my own theory of Oriental sensitivity specifically centers physicality, I provide a somewhat graphic description to think through how our bodies might implicate us in global phenomena. In short, one of my testicles had swelled to the size of a tennis ball. The abdominal pain that meant I could only walk for short distances. I finally decided to see a doctor. The Tai Chi master Michel Assouvi whisked me to a clinic where Assouvi, announcing me as a foreign professor as one might a foreign dignitary, pushed me in front of all the mothers and their small children in the queue, for which I still feel guilty. The white male physician probed my body and my reasons for being in Martinique as he was diagnosing me. He pronounced my condition as very serious, requiring an immediate visit to the hospital. At the hospital, over the course of 4 hours, I interacted with several more medical professionals, a white female doctor, and several Black nurses and assistants. And I'm just calling out the demographics because it may suggest some of the professional possibilities afforded to locals, given the development of medical schools on the island. I was given a sonogram and hooked up to an IV. This situation forced me to think about the various kinds of flows, from those associated with the hospital to the lack of fluids in my own body. Global medical technologies further remind me of the current pandemic moment and underscore the promise and peril of access to such systems. The obstetrician Ian Donald, born in England but raised partly in South Africa with a career that spanned England and Scotland after his service in World War II, developed the ultrasound machine for clinical use. He worked in conjunction with several Scottish engineers who had developed the technology to look for flaws in ships. So it comes back to Seascapes. Although adopted in the UK in the 1960s, the technology's international dissemination took another decade. The sonogram thus conjures a historical conjunction of nautical science and medicine, eventually distributed as a culturally unmarked diagnostic tool now used around the world. The ultrasound machine's presence in a Martinican hospital suggests how bodies become visible in relation to the transnational cultural flows, because it renders the human anatomy visible or legible in particular ways. The universalizing of certain science practices in comparison to the very culturally marked mind-body practice, which was also developed in part to assess and address health issues called Tai Chi, throws into relief the construction of the global in terms of how European or American wellness innovations so easily slide within that rubric, that is within the global, even as in this case, Chinese practices remain marked as such. So even the ads for the Tai Chi Club on the island mark its wellness, as you can see here. When I think back to my taxi ride to Fort-de-France from the hospital, I remember contemplating my own physical susceptibility to the tropical environment. My brief period attached to medical machinery reminded me of other bodies that had difficulty adapting to their new surroundings. Within my scholarly project, such populations included the first Chinese coolie labor brought to Trinidad. That venture failed partially because the Chinese men who worked Trinidad's plantations did not yield the expected amount of productivity. The story goes that one person worked while another held an umbrella to shield the couple from the sun. Whether apocryphal or not, the notion that an ethnic constitution might not withstand a particular environment resonated with me. This construction encouraged further my thinking about the phenomenological engagement of organic organisms within seascapes, and sometimes the surprising ways that such dynamics overlap with theatricality. In retrospect, I wonder again what caused my particular ailment and what the implications of the dialogues I had on that subject for my theorization of Oriental sensitivity might be. The doctors offered me a couple conjectures regarding my illness, including a speculation that I had picked up a parasite. That hypothesis reminded me of something that Assouvi had mentioned when I asked why so many Chinese shops carried plastic flowers. Assouvi answered, think about the climate. In this case, Chinese factories had created substitute props that could be displayed in place of fragile biological entities. Through these juxtapositions, I might posit more baldly than I do in my book, Oriental sensitivity as evoking or otherwise involving 4 dimensions: migrant labor, kinship, ecology, and phenomenology. Part of my overall project in the book was to underscore the legacies of coolie labor in the development of transnational capitalism, as well as in conditions of possibility for artistic expression that emerged from its wake. Unlike the slave trade, coolie networks have largely been repressed in popular memory. This elision likely results from the scale of the enterprise and the availability of data. In terms of raw numbers of laborers, the African slave trade involved far more people and investment. Moreover, scholars have argued that the archives of Asian migrant labor are dispersed and require an interpretive process that breeds against the grain of extant evidence. Also important, the lack of documentations of these workers' experiences as something akin to the slave narrative further inhibits understanding the lives of the coolies. In sum, we often know what happened to people, but not how they understood themselves or the worlds in which they lived. As I have argued, that kind of memory lapse often persists in regard to overseas Chinese labor, even today. That said, I'm not interested in historical recovery per se. What I hope to evoke instead is the imaginative reconstruction necessary in the face of the violence of forgetting. To borrow from literary scholar Ali Bedad, quote, post-colonial belatedness can be an oppositional practice only if it maintains a coeval recognition of its own historicity, its own worldliness, and makes use of its historical consciousness to critique the cultural conditions that continues to produce unequal relations of power today, end quote. Rather than fully subscribing to Said's notion of Orientalism, Oriental sensitivity moves in tandem with Bedad's departure from Said's thoughts. As Bedad contends, quote, Orientalism is not divided into accepted discourses of domination and excluded discourses of opposition. Rather, such a discourse of power makes allowance for a circular system of exchange between stabilizing strategies and disorienting elements that can produce variant effects, end quote. Insofar as Oriental sensitivity attunes us to the past in the French Antilles or elsewhere, it reconfigures our understanding of the present. As an illustration, positivist historical research about Martinique divides Chinese migration to the island in 3 waves. Scholars have concluded that the first wave of Chinese migrants died or repatriated. This is the 19th century. The second wave, circa 1930s, included entrepreneurs such as Mr. Ho, the traces of which are evident as in the factory I mentioned earlier. The third wave occurred in the 1990s after China's opening. Such schematics miss the interaction of these different historical currents. Yet my interview suggested that larger Chinese-run corporations now have, and likely had, the capacity to facilitate migratory passage through both informal and formal means. In other words, the company was sponsoring folks to come to Martinique. For Chinese diasporic communities, these kinds of practices have frequently been linked to biological, based on consanguinity, and performative, the phenomenon of paper sons, kinship. In this regard, Oriental sensitivity alerts us to the auto or self-orientalizing moves that reify family ties. Immigrant survival might necessitate these efforts. To adopt to a country can require legal documentation to substantiate a genetic or matrimonial bond to a citizen of a nation state. But such an endeavor is but one iteration of belonging. Claiming diaspora can also be a tactical maneuver, as evidenced in my brokering conversations with Chinese shopkeepers by emphasizing familial relations and implicitly suggesting a structure of filial piety that animated my research. In other words, I'm pursuing my ancestors or whatever. Nevertheless, as someone who has spent my entire career writing on Chineseness, I remain hyper-conscious of the pitfalls of such affiliations. Oriental sensitivity again provides one means to mark the unease of cultural assertion in terms of lineage. The term also enables us to interrogate certain claims, like that of the Tai Chi Club member who told me she felt Chinese, as well as Asuvi's own statements about the Chinese connections that facilitated his professional development. As Afro-Martinicans with affective and perhaps physical affiliations in terms of their movement practice with Chineseness, they challenge traditional notions of kinship based in biological relations. In a different context, queer theorist David Eng has written about feelings of kinship as, quote, collective, communal, and consensual affiliations, as well as the psychic, affective, and visceral bonds, end quote, that motivated his students to participate in the intellectual projects of Asian American studies. In the case of the Tai Chi Club members on Martinique, I would like to recast such feelings of kinship in the vein of Oriental sensitivity. This move forestalls attempts to rationalize kinship with racial identification and allows the possibility of cross-cultural and transnational kinship enacted through embodied connections. Here, I constellate Eng's queering of kinship with Jane Irimura's notion of the Oriental monk. Irimura traces this figure, both actual people and fictional characters, through a genealogical approach that emphasizes the American context of his emergence. As she elaborates, quote, although the Oriental monk has appeared to us through the various media vehicles of American popular culture, we recognize him as a representative of an otherworldly, though perhaps not entirely alien, spirituality that draws from the ancient wellsprings of Eastern civilization and culture, end quote. Iwamura notes that such figures might materialize through a heterogeneous field of encounter, but she finds their representational effects to be more or less homogeneous. What happens if we dislocate this icon from an American landscape? Certainly Asuvi, as an ambassador for Tai Chi, takes on several of the qualities Irimura associates with the Oriental monk, at least in his role as teacher. His demeanor, dress, and gender all correspond to characteristics that Irimura notes. Insofar as he embodies the role of the martial arts master, Asuvi aligns himself with this construction, but without its particularly American valences. Nevertheless, his own practice is also authenticated by a deep commitment to training that involves linkages to both France and China. In other words, his professional performance in the lineage of master and apprentice returns us to an expansive kinship, but in a somewhat queer manner. Filial devotion to a master remains absent of biological connection. Oriental sensitivity helps us to identify the complexities of such associations. No matter how genuine, they also circulate within larger epistemological frameworks, including stereotypes constituted through global imagery, like that of the Oriental monk. The localization and accommodation of such mass circulating imagery returns me to the very specific environment of Martinique and the representational histories of China relevant to that place. Several of these I've glossed in the Chinese Atlantic. But in my own elaborated discussion of Orientalism here, I want to turn again to Lisa's work in critical terrains, as she acknowledges different French writers yielding up several different kinds of intellectual projects. Sometimes organized through a French national esprit that's bound to theatricality. Much of this scholarship comes from literary critics like Lowe. The utility of Oriental sensitivity is to center the body, to remind us that the encounter with otherness is not only discursive, but also mediated through the senses. In terms of sensorial engagement, and given the complicated history of globalization, the analytic of Oriental sensitivity might help to illuminate intercultural and colonial trade, as well as the meanings and legacies of such extant evidence beyond the confines of Martinique. For example, a Dutch still life from the 17th century that would seem to depict a relatively homogeneous community might nevertheless evince dynamic connections to the porcelain bowl that holds its fruit. In such a case, we might initially consider the construction and circulation of the actual objects that gave rise to paintings of such bowls. In cases like this one, perhaps a shipment of Chinese goods that the Dutch pirated from Portuguese traders. Questions about provenance and movement return us to issues of kinship and labor, albeit in different registers that I have discussed in relation to Tai Chi. Yet such queries still emerge through Oriental sensitivity, as well as the user's relationships to such artifacts and the representations of them, which generate mediated and localized knowledges of China and Chineseness for populations scattered around the world. Orientations towards such objects and images, how they facilitate certain kinds of interaction, return us to another set of inquiries. In this regard, Oriental sensitivity elucidates a phenomenological encounter. I've discussed such issues in relation to the ways Tai Chi stimulates bodily awareness in the Chinese Atlantic. However, had I taken a different emphasis in my study, I might also have perceived Asia through the incense wafting through store aisles, or the scent of dumplings steaming through the snacks. Sensory stimuli also recalls for me the Indian indentured workers who had labored on the island as I tried on a garment of Madras, an omnipresent textile in Martinican marketplaces. That fabric contrasts in terms of its drape and absorbent quality with a silk that Asuvi wore teaching, which you see here. Oriental sensitivity thus directs us not only to articulations of and embodied enactments of Chineseness, but also potentially to the tastes and smells and physical objects that might connote or actually reveal the global circulation of Asia. Because Oriental sensitivity aligns, for me, historical and contemporary movements of Chinese aesthetics, people, and things in particular, I have thought about it in relation to the discourse of COVID-19 and the anti-Asian sentiments that have been expressed in its wake. Statements like President Trump's, with which I began this essay, consolidate Chinese labor and its circulation as a threat to humanity. We might say it reactivates a yellow peril discourse, but that phrase does not fully capture the scale evoked either at the macro level, in terms of the perception that Chinese actions could end the world, or at the micro level, in terms of the physicality of encounters, as people shy away from phenotypically Asian folks at the grocery store. The flexibility of scale, along with considerations of place, labor, and circulation, and phenomenological experience, suggests the utility of Oriental sensitivity. Finally, unlike a yellow peril discourse with its othering valence, Oriental sensitivity inflects differently the threat of COVID-19 in terms of kinship. We are susceptible, not because we are different, but because we are so much the same. Thank you.
Sorry about that. I had to unmute myself. Thank you so much for such a rich and thought-provoking talk. And I just want to remind people to please type your questions into the chat box. Yeah, and then I will read them out loud. But I figured I would start with questions because I have a number of questions. Or I start with at least one. I mean, I just really, this idea of Orientalist sensitivity is so rich, and I'm just really curious, and I really valued how much you described your own process and your ethnographic research and your approach and really this, the experiences. And I'm just wondering if what you think about, does Orientalist sensitivity always put the researcher at the center of, is it always encouraging this engagement with what the researcher's subject position, experiences, senses, emotions, all of that?
That's a great question, thanks. I think for me, when I'm interested in phenomenology because, although I don't really elaborate a great deal in my book, but the more I worked on the stuff I was doing, the more it became evident that that might be a direction I go in next. Because subjectivity is generated always relationally, right? So it's always you in relation to whatever you're perceiving, and vice versa if you're looking at another subject. And I think that's quite useful. It also, of course, corresponds with lots of theoretical models that are popular right now, from the uptake of Deleuze and Guattari to Glissant to Latour. All those people are interested in kind of relational kinds of subjectivity, and I think that's been a turn in sort of critical theory, but I think an important one as we get around, as we need to think about more collectivity again in different kinds of ways. So for me, it does always involve the person perceiving as well as that which is being perceived. But I think I find that productive in a way. I don't think it has to be like, necessarily a full autoethnographic disclosure all the time. Although I think sometimes it's useful to point that out because often our expertise is marked by, factors like language skill or, your PhD in field or whatever. And those things are also mediated and institutionalized in particular ways, right? So I think Ray Chow has written a lot about this as well.
Great. Well, and just a follow up, I mean, this idea of the person perceiving and being seen, I wonder if there's this question of like ethics in that as well. Like just thinking about, Levinasian ethics and this idea of like seeing the other, if that's at all part of it, as because that's something that evokes for me.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think that's, yes. And I think, when I wrote the text, it was, Oriental sensitivity came, sort of later in the process, and I thought, well, I should, and I had a debate about whether to include it or not because it really shifted the discourse a lot. And in the end, I did decide to include it, but it also meant I had to change other things in the book to make it so it wasn't just such a radical break. And in doing that process, I had to come to terms with like what does it mean to do research on globalization when globalization, like a lot of people do globalization from a single case study and then generalize, right? And if you're going to do it sort of what many of my readers called inductively, from a lot of different sites, I don't think it's possible to be a non-tourist in so many different spaces. So I really wanted to call attention to that kind of ethics, but also not to just lament the fact that when we have surface encounters, they're surfacey. I mean, obviously, but we do that more and more nowadays. And I think there's some productivity to the notion of the surface or, passing encounters, especially in the ways that we become aware of global circulations at different times, right? Either when we're at the supermarket and looking at like what chemicals have been thrown onto our food or whatever, or when we use app products, or when we actually travel. I think for me, this helps foreground positionality in order to get at precisely ethical questions that are sometimes elided if we try to be sort of more objective. Yeah, and also calls attention to limitations. I think I did this project with a group of scholars on framing the global, and we all had different projects and we all came together. But people working on, one person was working on the Pacific Basin, one person was working on Hungary. We all had global projects in different ways, and when we talked, it became evident that like, oh, each of us perceives global research in a different way, and so we're trying to think, well, what are methods that we can get at that with various types of expertise. And I think what I learned from that experience was that you need multiple voices. If you're going to claim to do global stuff, you need multiple voices, period. And enacting that in a academic publishing industry that's so single authored focused is difficult. So I was trying to think of, well, maybe this is one way to call attention to that fact in our own scholarly protocols.
Yeah, I think that's and this idea of surface encounter, I think is totally fascinating and really, really interesting thinking about. I mean, and also thinking about COVID-19 and our potential limitations for our research and how that might be changing too. I wonder if this could also be another way to kind of think through these kind of how to work in different realms, because we're forced to. Yeah, and I wonder if I'll go ahead and ask one more question, is just about kind of think, as you talk about different voices and different, really different definitions of the global, and something that really just comes to mind when we think about, in thinking about kind of reframing globalization. I mean, this is a little bit of a kind of tangent, or not tangent, but veering a little off course, but I guess the longstanding kind of idea of Chen's Asia as method and this idea of multiple reference points. And I'm wondering if they can at all, just because I've seen this kind of Asia as method come up recently again, and if there's a way to put Orientalist sensitivity in relationship to Asia as method, Chen's Asia as method, or not.
Yeah, no, I think I was doing minor Asias, the journal volume, and writing that introduction. I guess I started thinking about it before the book actually came out. So I had it in mind as I was rethinking things that, you finish a project and you always think, oh, like, what could I have done differently or better? And so, this is a long way to get to your question, but I will get to your question, I promise. so my positionality within Asian studies has always been kind of just on the outside of the sort of mainstay. So like people were interested in what I had to say because I'm more drawn to theory, but as a consequence, of course, my language skills suck. So like there was always that trade-off. But I think what I have sort of made my career doing is thinking about Asia outside of Asia, and thinking about how that circulates and how those kinds of circulations, like if you, rather than thinking of Asia just as geographically bound, what happens if you think of it as like what are all those diasporic communities, not just people, but also circulations of culture do to our notion of Asia when you bring it back home. So I think in that way, I'm pretty close to Asia's method of thinking of like, oh, these are the things that emerge from a kind of a colonial moment when Asia became legible, right? That process is ongoing nowadays as different regions in Asia become sort of what Saskia Sassen calls global cities, sort of, globally relevant. And each time that happens, or each time we have a kind of new economic sort of burst of productivity, things reconfigure, right? So businesses start to rethink and everything. So like the Pacific Rim, emerged because of that reason, right? So I think for me, Asia as method is useful because we live in a neo-colonial world where those things structure culture in ways that we don't expect, and far away from the regions that we expect them to take shape, right? So so it helps me think about but what does that mean in terms of South Africa? What does it mean to really think of the Chinese presence in South Africa and the Taiwanese presence in South Africa? I think that has very specific connotations, and I write about that a bit, but in the last chapter. But I think there's something very productive about thinking about how Asia produces meaning contextually in different places at different historical moments. And I take that as part of what kind of Asia as method does, in addition to calling attention to very specific sort of intra-regional colonial dynamics. But those also affect larger cultural civilizations and larger colonial dynamics. So if by example, I would say like South Africa for me is interesting because it's precisely the relationship between Taiwan and China that makes Chinese and South Africa so complicated, because when South Africa was under apartheid, Chinese and the PRC was being recognized by the UN, South Africa and Taiwan were not. So it made them allies in a way that they would never otherwise have been. But as a consequence, a lot of Taiwanese industrialists went to South Africa. And so for, in the 80s, that was Taiwanese industrialists became Chinese, like they were the Chinese presence. Nowadays, after apartheid ended, that's totally changed in that region, because the PRC again has, that's the largest trading partner is China between South Africa. Does that answer your question, or did I just talk about it?
Of course, yes, no, yeah, of course. And yeah, this idea of Asia outside Asia, I think is really a great, like, really, really fantastic to think about, and how Asia produces meaning. Like, absolutely fascinating. I'm going to get to a couple questions have come up about really, because this definition of Orientalist sensitivity is so complex, and you list a number of different points to it. Some of our audience members are asking if you could provide an exact definition, and I would follow it with saying, is a definition actually, is it possible to create or define it in a distilled way, or is Orientalist sensitivity more an approach and methodology than anything else?
So, I started grad school in Complet, but in a moment when deconstruction was very big in the academy. And so my thinking tends to be deconstructive. So I'm always less interested in sort of offering a hegemonic theory or a theory that would totalize. So I find Orientalism useful in a way, but it's totalizing, right? So for Said, that was like the world is divided in half. One half has power, one half has less power. But we know things are more complicated than that. But so for him, Orientalism was a power structure, and he's very clear about that, of Europe over the East. So that is so untextured that I think, but at the time may be useful as a kind of call to action. For scholars. But for me, I like when I think through theory, there are invitations to think with me and through other paradigms. So I think of Oriental sensitivity as a way of deconstructing Orientalism precisely through things like migration, kinship, phenomenology. So that may not be, satisfactory to some folks, but I also think, like, I did this work in Martinique very specifically when I developed this, and it was very specific, like, because it was in that place that I was really confronted with, oh, my body is falling apart and I'm being stuck to these machines. And I, who am critiquing globalization, and suddenly very happy to be in a place where they have global machines, because I really wanted something I recognized, like I know what a sonogram is, I know, like, what an IV is, like that was very comforting to me. But also makes it very hard to then critique, like, how can you critique global circulation? Only certain kinds of medical supplies are okay. So, this was, but I expect that would look differently in different places. And indeed it does. I think and also the way I read as a subject myself is very different in different locations. So I think I want the definition to be flexible, something that you can kind of think through in relation to a specific case study. So what happens if you deconstruct an Orientalist kind of construction in your own case study, but think through it with a kind of phenomenological lens, with a kind of a queering of kinship lens, because I found in social sciences so often what gets naturalized is, oh, like Chinese people, we count them everywhere. So like there's Chinese population is this large, like in Martinique, there's 1,000, right? And you have no idea what that means to the people who are, just from that number, you don't know what that means to the people who are living that reality, nor to the people who are describing them that way. So I'm trying to call attention to a more textured approach to thinking through specifically East-West relations, right? So in East-West cultural relations, and in my case it was Chinese, but you could use a different one. I think Nakamura also, when she's talking about the Oriental monk, she's thinking mostly of, she thinks of people like Bruce Lee but she also thinks of it's Japanese and Chinese only, right? But there are other kinds of monks that have circulated from Tibet most specifically, right? So we can think of, like, if you used a different example, you get a very different look or understanding of what that term meant. But hopefully it'd be a way to think through, like, oh, so Asia has to be disaggregated when we're thinking through what Asian American means, or what Asian, and I also work in the Caribbean a lot. What do different sort of claims of Asian affiliation mean in that space?
Yeah, and really, what I think is fascinating is this idea of the local or the specific that you keep returning us to in this discussion of the global, as part of this Orientalist sensitivity, that it really is very much, to me, grounded in your cases and your experiences and this encounters. So, and you just think about, and I don't know if you would like to say anything about questions of the local.
Well, I can tell you it drove my my reviewers crazy for the book, because one of the things, because everyone said, like, oh, this is unusual. It's like inductive, not deductive. So deductive would be like you apply a theory to these case studies, and the case studies just illustrate the theory. I think both my books do this to a certain degree, because they emerged from case studies that I then came to generalize from. Even though I'm drawn to philosophical work, but I'm not interested in philosophical work that's just applied to something. And so you make the case study fit the philosophy, or there happens to be some resonance. But I am interested when things resonate, when you start from the ground up and things start to resonate at a certain level of abstraction. So like, oh, like, I was working all over the Caribbean I was traveling all over, but I ended up choosing to write on Trinidad and Martinique, but I was also in Guadeloupe. I was thinking about writing, including Cuba, and I was in Jamaica. Different things came to the surface as commonalities, even as some things were really, really, really different. So in Trinidad, especially, because the Asian population there is 45% of the overall island population, what local meant was so different, because South Asian indentured labor really shaped that island in a particular way. So really, and they really occupy the commercial sector, and Afro-Trinidadians, who are another 45%, occupy the political sector. But that kind of tension, like, you could not then generalize from that space and then go to a place like Martinique, even though colonialism affected them both, and they're both, they're not that far from each other in the Caribbean, because Martinique has such a different demographic and a different history. And also because Martinique, the notion of the French citizen is that you're French. So French first. So difference is always submerged under Frenchness, whatever difference you are. So, which is very different from the English colonial system, right? Where you're like, when you're other, and you don't participate in the political system. So I think those two traditions, I wanted to contrast those two things, partly because I think the local really informs how things mean. So when someone comes through as Chinese in Trinidad, it just meant differently. So people, and in complex ways. So although Chinese folks have always been in Trinidad since the 19th century, when they started borrowing money to build like performing arts centers and stuff from China, borrowing money from China to build these things in Trinidad, people started re-narrating the Chinese populations that were already there, because it was an attempt to say, like, look, when you're marketing to Chinese investors, from China that is, to say like, oh, look, we have this tradition here. It's just like you, so you should invest here because you'll be comfortable with us. And I found that very interesting. Martinique doesn't have that. But what Martinique had was a very strong, very specific infrastructure provided by one or two companies who had enough money. So OUN is this company that had, they're like a huge grocery conglomerate in Francophone Caribbean. So they can literally sponsor, they can sponsor visas if they want to, but they can also take informal folks and make them formal by, I'm extrapolating here, so I'm not completely sure this happened, but I'm guessing that one of the things that's happened is that they have, some people have been identified as migrants without papers, but they can employ people officially and then get them papers. So is that they offer a different kind of pathway to French citizenship.
Oh wow!
Yeah. So I get lost in the specificities a little bit, but I would just say, the local matters to me because it is the things that are specific are really interesting, and they inhibit. You can think about a global process, but that global process always kind of rubs up against or is mediated by some sort of local context.
And has local consequences.
Yeah.
With factual bodies and people. We have a question from. So, how do you address the term Chinese virus, and how important do you believe it is to understand all cultures from different locations around the world? That's a good question.
Yeah, that's broad and big. So I understand the Chinese virus as just a Trumpian kind of neologism designed to create more racial tension. To be honest, that's what I feel it is. So I think it's like it's a scapegoating process, so that he's not responsible. So he doesn't seem responsible for not taking care of people, addressing COVID publicly. And we have seen these processes before, somewhat with like HIV, for example, when it's an outbreak. But this is very specifically marked towards Chinese folks. So that's what I would say about that. I think it's a construction designed for what I would consider insidious political purposes. I guess that's how I would say it in brief. In terms of world cultures, I think we do the best. It depends on what one means by that. But I think as global citizens, we try to be responsible in our encounters. I guess that's one of the things that I would like to teach students is we try to be respectful and accountable and responsible when we're encountering things, but we will always encounter newness. That's the great part of being human, I guess. And so my feeling is my research has put me in a place where I consider, I'm always writing about difference, but the reason, and a lot of people write about race, I write about race through Chineseness, which is perhaps a little bit less common than some folks. And that means I deal with a lot of minority populations that people don't think about very often, like the 54 in China itself. So and I think that's actually, for me, for Chinese studies, that's the future of the future of Chinese studies is like in the minority populations, right? Because I think there's a lot of work that's not been done on thinking about what difference does to the notion of the Chinese state or Chinese state rhetoric. And there's a lot of simmering tension, sometimes very explicit in Tibet or in Xinjiang, but in all the populations, I think there's a lot to be learned from how difference gets managed at a biopolitical level, and both for ill and for not. Yeah, so I do think it's important. I think South Africa is also very complicated. So when I think about race, I'm doing a South African cinema class right now, and race is very complicated and has changed in South Africa, but it's very clear in South Africa because during apartheid it was so legislated. So you can look at the laws and you can say like, okay, so what counts as Black right now? What's colored, which is a racial category for them? What's Asian? And what's white? Right. So those debates were important because they enable people literally mobility within a city, certain kinds of job access or whatever. And Chinese people in South Africa, weirdly, were classified as Asian, as Black, or they were tried to be classified as Black most recently, and in one case as white. So there are a lot, the contestation was because it's whatever the government was offering as its rubric to classify race came with certain benefits. And so the Chinese folks initially, they wanted to be classified as Asian so they didn't have to go to Black townships. or at least as colored, so then they could go to colored townships, because there were more resources in the colored townships. There was a case of Chinese folks market folks living in a white neighborhood, and they wanted to stay in the white neighborhood. So they filed a petition with their white neighbors to say, like, can we classify this person who's Chinese as white so they can stay here? They're a good citizen, et cetera, et cetera. After apartheid ended and reparations were being given to the population, there was a benefit to being Black. And so Chinese people who also felt like they had been oppressed during apartheid said, well, we also deserve reparations. So we would like to be classified as Black because we were treated poorly. So those kinds of nuances, I think, are very productive in thinking through, like, terms like race and difference manifest very specifically through local conditions. And I'm very interested in how that works and tracing that through. And sometimes it's hard, and I slip sometimes, but I think it's productive. So for example, it gives me a perspective on Black Lives Matter that's, I think, different than a lot of people, because for me, the internationalization of that movement is both is somewhat hopeful, but also problematic, because what is being sort of labeled as Black, at least from my perspective, is state-sanctioned anti-Black violence. So that's one way to organize coalitions, but it's not, but it's predicated on, that's like saying, I'm going to predicate Black life on Black death. And that makes me hesitant, because I think, oh, there must be other ways that we can think of commonality and affiliation that don't center dead people.
Well, and thank you so much for that, because I know some of the people in the audience are my students from an Asian American theater course. So it was really great to hear your thoughts about this, questions about nuances, about race, about thinking through racial identity through the local. I'll ask the last question, which is a little bit of, it's in part because, so as someone who has Japanese heritage, when I go, I'll just say that when I go to Japan to do research, where my research primarily is, it comes up. And so I really, it was really great to hear you talk a little bit about that, how it came up as someone with Chinese heritage in these spaces. And I'm just wondering if you're willing to talk a little bit more about that, about how these experiences changed, how that might have changed your approach as a researcher in these particular environments.
Yeah, I think for me, it's I'm trying to think of how long the answer I'm going to give to this, but race in academia is very complicated, as we know. It's complicated everywhere, but in academia, because it has value in academia as well, and that's where things get really complicated. Because when I was going out, leaving grad school, someone said, "Oh, you need to insert your Chinese name into your legal name, because otherwise you'll be illegible." And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And also incredibly essentializing, but also can't the work just speak for that? Does it have to be marked in that way? And that's been something I thought about a lot over my career, when people want to mark me or when they don't want to mark me, and what terms like Asian American or Chinese mean. So I think in the book, one of the things that happened was, because I have a great-grandfather who was Chinese, who went to Cuba, and the rest of the Chinese family just went to the US. So there's a link there. But sometimes I found it difficult to start conversations with people because I'm not an ethnographer either. So just having conversations, I always try to move too quickly to philosophy or globalization or whatever, and they're like, So I think it was just easier to talk about family first. And it opened up weird conversations, like in the Trinidad, they were like, "Oh, Chinese boy," and I was like, "Uh-huh." And so the artist I had been in dialogue with, he sort of wanted to adopt me, and then he introduced me to his whole family, and they took me on this retreat with them. And it was, I think, in that case, it was very helpful. In Martinique as well, it was helpful because it gave me a way to talk about, even though I knew I was sort of commodifying myself in a certain way, it gave me a way and a reason to talk to people and to interrupt them and say oh, I noticed and especially because, you know, my Chinese is much more fluent around family issues than it is around like, academic stuff anyway. But so it made it easier to have those kinds of conversations. In China, where I also do some work, you know, I'm generally not recognized as Chinese at all. And if I say I'm Chinese, they absolutely refuse it. So, you know, so generally they say, oh, you mean your mother is like overseas Chinese. She's not Chinese, Chinese. And then she'll say like, you're American. Like, obviously you are American. Like, and so that's always been interesting to me because no matter how much knowledge I have, or like, let's say we're talking about Chinese literature, so perhaps I would know more than the person I'm speaking to. It doesn't, like, that knowledge doesn't translate at all. It's just like, well, Chinese means something. And so so means something to them very specific. And it often means Han, Mandarin speaking, you know, and I think that's why I think this is a kind of interesting lens, because obviously China is not only Han and Mandarin speaking. That's like a kind of colonial myth. But, you know, can we interrogate that, and what would happen if we do that? I think I find that, I mean, I guess I only have anecdotes for this, but it sort of leads to all kinds of questions. So when I first started going to China in the 90s, I was in Beijing, and you used to be able to tell people who were non-Han because of the one-child policy, because ethnic minorities were spared the one-child policy, so you could have more than one. So if you saw a taxi driver who had pictures of 2 kids, very, very likely that person was not Han Chinese or was something else. And so that you could always like start conversations that way, but also make conversation difficult because that also Mandarin wasn't that great. So but it's just like a whole different infrastructure, a whole different way of the biopolitical, of the way that the country shapes the notion of Chineseness and how it gets activated politically, what's considered threatening and what's considered non-threatening, especially now as Xi Jinping, you know, is trying to sinicize Mongolia, trying to sinicize Xinjiang. Those are like real serious, I mean, I would call them ethnic cleansing policies, but they're hard to see unless you just to understand the texture of how race works in that space. So I guess that's my career is sort of invested, and my life, I guess, is invested in thinking that through. You know, like I tend to gravitate towards the most liminal of the minor populations. So I'm an Asian Americanist, but I do performance and sexuality studies in that field. You know, I do Caribbean studies, but I do Chinese Caribbean studies. I'm always at the margins of things because I think the margins help illustrate something about the dominant culture.
Well, I think that's a fantastic place to end. And again, I really want to, I want to thank our audience for joining us. And I want to, again, really thank Professor Metzger for your fantastic talk and this fascinating Q&A. And thank you, everyone. And I hope everyone, and I will see people later. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much.